If you want to lift your 2019 or newer Silverado 1500 to get a better stance and fit a bigger tire, and you want a little more than a spacer lift to do it so you can maintain a comfortable ride, this SuperLift 3-inch suspension lift kit with Bilstein shocks will be a great one to look into. Now I do want to note that this will not fit the Trail Boss and ZR2 models, so just keep that in mind while you're shopping. Now the added shocks, control arms, and accommodating hardware will make this kit great for the truck owner who wants a more advanced version of a spacer lift, which will save you some money and also save you some comfort compared to some other basic choices. Now this will lift and level the truck, not only making it look much more aggressive on-road for style if that's your goal, but also to make your truck much more capable if you do hit the dirt, whether it's occasionally or every day. The components here will work very well together to provide a lot of benefits for your truck beyond the more aggressive stance that you're getting. The medium lift height that this offers will allow up to a 33-inch tire in the wheel well, remaining comfortable with no rub or modifications needed, and will increase ground clearance, so if you're going off-road, whether you're camping, hunting, or on the work site, you will be able to avoid hazards much better than before. In addition to the height, the Bilstein 5100 series shocks will also allow for stiffer dampening in the rear for a more controlled ride, but also Bilstein's digressive valving will help with adapting to different conditions like switching from on-road to on the dirt, being ready to adapt to your lifestyle. Now, along with the better ride in the back, the correctly sized control arms for the front and the smaller hardware like the differential and sway bar spacers will help lessen the harsher angles that are put on the suspension when you're lifting it to maintain a good ride without swapping the strut. Breaking down the construction, starting with the control arms, these will have a reinforced steel build with Moog ball joints that will be very similar to factory, but positioned correctly for better wheel alignment than the stock arms, and the ball joint is greasable, so you can maintenance these over time. Now, the spacers included for the front strut are made of a billet aluminum construction, including a top spacer here and a preload spacer, but I do want to call out that these will measure to about 1 inch and about a ½ inch for the preload spacer, but the suspension geometry and spring compression is what is going to achieve that 3 inches of lift in the front. Now the rear spacer will sit on a solid axle, being true to size at 1½ inches of lift for the back, evening out the height from front to rear, achieving that even and level stance, and they'll be made of a really thick steel material with a black powder coat on top. Now the shocks will be one of the more complex components out of this kit. They're built very well to withstand a lot of abuse for whatever you're doing, including hauling and towing. They have a 46mm monotube gas charged construction to resist any shock fade or aeration that causes that squishy feeling over time for dependable performance. And the steel body will also be zinc plated to resist any rust over time. They're also going to have hardened neoprene rubber bushings, which are much stronger than the average rubber that you get out of the factory that can get brittle over time, allowing a long-lasting construction. This kit will be about $1,000 and right in the middle of the road compared to others in the category. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, this is going to be a little bit more advanced than the typical spacer lift that may cost less than this one, but won't come with the additional components that you may need or want to up the performance. Now, we'll also keep it pretty mild, not only in height, but if you don't want to swap everything out and get too involved, this is going to allow for that while being well built and highly rated. This kit will come with all of the hardware needed for the install, replacing most of the hardware, so you're not going to have to reuse any parts here, but it will have a little bit more of an advanced process because you are working with your suspension. I'm going to give this a 3 out of 3 wrenches on the difficulty meter, considering that you will need a spring compressor for this and other specialty tools in order to get this installed. So with the right setup, you should be looking at about 6 hours, give or take. Now at this point, we are going to break the install down step by step, whether you're curious about the process or you're set up with the right tools and experience and are doing it yourself. So that is going to wrap it up for my review. Let's go ahead and get into the install.
Tools required for this install include a couple different size impact guns, a ratchet, a hammer, a rubber mallet, 11 and 17mm wrenches, 14 and 21mm ratcheting wrenches, a couple pairs of C-clamps, a swivel adapter, 10, 11, 14, 15, 18, and 21mm sockets, an extension, a 21mm swivel socket, a pair of vice grips, a pry bar, and a spring compressor. What's up guys? Today we're installing a lift kit on our Silverado. First we're going to watch a quick uninstall video showing you how to remove your factory front struts, and then I'll meet you back here for the upper control arm and the rear.
All right, first step here, once you get your wheels out of the way and your vehicle supported up in the air, we're going to start removing our ABS line bracket. There's one here on the knuckle and one on the upper control arm. Grab a 10mm socket and get those off. Now what I like to do is once you pop that off, I like to just put the bolt back on just so we don't lose it. Just a couple of threads, and then do the one at the top. Next up, we're going to remove our sway bar end link. Now this is a pretty difficult one. You want to have a couple of specialty tools here. Not necessarily specialty tools, but specific tools. What you want to use is an 18mm wrench. Put that on the nut here on the back first. Then you're going to grab a 1/4 inch ratchet and a 9mm deep socket and hold that stud on the back end. And you're going to ratchet this guy off like this instead of ratcheting the nut, just because it's a really tight space. So using the 9mm on the stud itself, you can start to loosen it all the way up and remove it. All right, once you have that nut backed all the way off, pull the end link out of the sway bar, and then I'm just going to put the nut back on the stud. Next, we're going to tackle the upper control arm to the knuckle here by removing the 18mm nut. I'm going to use an 18 ratcheting wrench for this. Now if it gets to the point where the entire stud is spinning, you can put this guy in there, follow it up with the appropriate size Allen key, and hold that stud steady. All right, making life easier here because this is starting to get stuck, we're going to switch over to a T40 Torx socket, and using my ratchet, we're going to hold that stud steady and ratchet this guy the rest of the way off. There you go. And what I like to do is just take the nut, put it right back on the stud. Next up, switch over to a 21 deep socket and get the tie rod end off. All right, we may need to grab a hammer to knock this guy loose. Once you have that knocked loose, let's pull that guy out. And just like the other ones, I'm gonna put this nut back on. Next up, switch over to a 15 deep socket. We're going to get the 2 bolts holding the bottom of the strut to the lower control arm off. All right, next up, grab a 14mm ratcheting wrench. We're going to remove the top 3 nuts holding on the strut here. That's going to be the last step before the strut comes out. There are 2 right here in the front you can easily see, and 1 deeper in the back, which is difficult to see, but you're just going to hit these 2 and then repeat for the 1 in the back. Once you break it loose, you can usually get it off by hand. Okay, repeat that for the 1 in the back. All right, from there, pull this guy down and set it aside.
So now with our factory strut removed, we can move on to our upper control arm. We've got a 21mm bolt and nut on each side. So I'll grab a 21mm socket and wrench to pop those out. Now with our bolts removed, we can pull straight back and remove our upper control arm, and we'll do the same thing on the other side. So now we can bring our strut over to the spring compressor. I've got our bottom mount hooked onto the spring and the top on the top of the top hat. So we're gonna put some tension on this, and then we'll take an 18mm socket and remove our nut on top. And once we have some play in the strut, we can go ahead and try to remove that nut. So now I'm gonna take an 18mm socket on an impact gun to remove our nut. Now you wanna make sure before you do this, you have good tension on that spring so it doesn't explode in your face. And we can slide our strut out from the bottom. And now we can relieve the tension on our spring so that we can remove our whole top hat and the whole assembly for it. And we'll just wiggle that whole assembly off the spring. I'm just gonna leave that spring here for now. So now we're gonna come over to the vise next. We need to pop off this boot first. So this just wiggles off. And then we're gonna pop out our bump stop and this ring here. Just work your way around and pop that off. And then we're left with this. So we're gonna have to hammer out all of our studs on top. So I'm gonna put this into a vise, clamp that down, and then we're gonna take a hammer and just give it a couple whacks on the tip here to hammer these out. And once you have all those studs popped out, we can pop that out of our vise. So now we can start assembling our top hat assembly onto our spring. First thing we're gonna do is take our boot. We're gonna line up this little notch with the end of our spring. Rotate it until it stops. And then we can take our spring perch. We're gonna line up that same little notch with our boot. And push that into place. And then on the back side here, we have these two little nubs that are gonna line up with the two holes in our spacer. So we can just lay that down on top. Next, we can add the spacer with the holes cut out for our studs. We're gonna lay that right on top. And then we can grab our actual top hat and our bump stop. We have these little notches where that bump stop is gonna sit. So we'll line it up and then press that in. And now we're gonna take our 3 new studs and slide those through the holes. Now just line everything up and drop this down. Make sure those bolts go into the cutouts. And now we can compress our spring with our top hat and get our strut back installed. So now with this loaded up into our spring compressor, we can crank down on it to compress our spring. And that'll be good, so we can get our nut on. And then grab our 18mm socket and tighten it down. And then we can relieve the tension on our spring. And then you can do that same thing with your other strut. So now we can start assembling our front suspension. So we're gonna start with our upper control arm. You just wanna match this up to the orientation of your stock one, since they are side specific. So we'll get our 2 bolts in. And then we'll thread the nuts onto the other side. Next, you're gonna grab this temporary spacer included in the kit. What this is gonna do is space your upper control arm out evenly, so that's where you're gonna be tightening it down. So it's gonna go right in here and sit on the upper control arm, and this is the angle they want you to tighten down the control arm at. So once you have that in place, then you can take your 21mm socket and wrench to tighten down your bolt. And once you have that tightened down, you can remove that temporary spacer. Next, we can install our strut. So we're gonna take our spacer and put that on the top of our studs, just like that. There's only one way this can go, so you can't put it on backwards, sideways. And then we'll slide this into place, get it up in the upper mount, and then we're gonna be reusing our factory nuts, and we can thread a couple on up top, just to hold it in place. Next, we can reinstall our lower strut bolts. Now our hardware has been replaced, so ours is going to be a little different from yours. We have a bolt going in from the top and a flange nut on the bottom. Do the same thing on the other side. And then again, our hardware is different. So for us, we're using a 15mm socket on our nut and a 17mm wrench on the bolt, but yours will be a little different. Now I'm just gonna go back and forth, tightening this down evenly. Next, we can go back up top and take a 14mm ratcheting wrench to tighten down our upper strut nuts. And once we have that all tightened, we can grab a plastic cover and put it back on our stud. Next, we're gonna connect our upper control arm ball joint to the knuckle. So I'm gonna have to get a pry bar in here to pry up on the upper control arm so that we can connect our knuckle to it. And then we can pry down to get that through the knuckle and install our new castle nut. And then we can grab our 18mm socket to tighten this down. And then next we'll be installing our cotter pin. Now we have a hole in the stud that is gonna line up with one of these little slots. If it's not completely lined up, you wanna tighten it a little more. You never wanna loosen it to get the hole to line up. I'm gonna put this through the back to the front. And I'm just gonna bend that down around the stud. Now, one important note is these are not greased from the factory, so you're gonna have to get a grease gun to put onto this fitting and grease up your ball joint. Now, you wanna add grease until you see this boot start to expand. It's very important because if you don't put grease in here, then it won't cover the warranty for the upper control arm. So make sure you do that step. Next, we can reattach the bracket to our upper control arm. Now, we don't have threads in the aftermarket one, so we have a new bolt. So we'll get the bolt and the flat washer going through the bracket and then through the upper control arm. And then we have a washer and a lock nut for the bottom of that bolt. And now we're gonna take an 11mm socket and wrench to tighten that down. Next, we can reattach our brake line bracket. Thread that 10mm bolt in and tighten it down with your 10mm socket. Now we can button up everything else besides our sway bar. So we can reinstall this ABS bracket and tighten that down with our 10mm socket. And then we'll get that bracket on the back of the knuckle. And tighten that down with the same 10mm socket. And we can pop our tie rod end back into the knuckle. Thread that nut on the bottom and take our 21mm socket to tighten it down. Now, to wrap up the front, we have to install our sway bar spacers. So we're gonna have to remove our sway bar from the mounts. We have bolts that are gonna go into these hex cutouts, just like that, and they're gonna stick down, and we have a new nut that we're gonna be securing our sway bar with. And then we're just gonna be putting our factory hardware back up into the frame. So I'm gonna grab myself a buddy. I'm gonna have him do the other side while I do this side, get it knocked out both at the same time, because if you get one spacer in on one side, it's gonna be a little hard to get it lined up on the other. So now I've got my buddy on the other side. I already undid the bolts on his side. So I'm gonna take my 10mm socket and remove them on my side. And now that sway bar can drop out of the way. And now we'll get our spacer and thread those bolts in. Now I'm going to tighten those bolts back down. I'll pass that impact gun to my buddy so he can tighten his side down. And then we'll get the bracket around our sway bar up onto those two studs and thread our nuts on. And now we'll grab our 14mm socket to tighten down our two nuts. I'm gonna go back and forth, tighten this down as evenly as possible. And then you can do that same thing on the other side. And now to wrap up the front, we just need to reinstall our end links back into our lower control arm. Now you wanna make sure you get both end links in on both sides at the same time, because as soon as you put one side in and put a nut on there, you're not gonna be able to lift the other side up high enough to get it into the hole. So I've already got the one on the other side lined up. Now I'm gonna take a pry bar and lift up on the sway bar to drop that end link into place. And I'll just double check that the other side is still in the hole. And then I'm gonna pry down on the sway bar and thread the nut on. And I'll take my 18mm socket to tighten that down and do that same thing on the other side. So now moving on to the rear, the first thing we need to do is remove our shock. So I'm gonna grab a 21mm socket and wrench to pull that out. So now we're gonna start on our bottom mount. I've got a pole jack here to support the weight of the axle while we start removing things. So I'll take a 21mm socket and wrench and pop this bolt out. Next we can go up top and take a 21mm socket to remove our bolt. Next we can come to our U-bolts, take a 21mm socket and remove all of these nuts. And then we can remove this bracket and push our U-bolts up and out of the way. Now we're going to twist our pole jack to lower down our axle. Next we have to remove this center bolt on our leaf springs. So I'm going to grab some C-clamps to hold the two sides of our leaves together. And now I'm gonna get a pair of vice grips to grab that pin at the bottom. And I'll grab a 15mm socket on my impact gun to remove this nut. And I can start to wiggle that down using the vice grips. So now with this freed up, I'm gonna push up on the leaf spring so that we have enough clearance to get this bolt out. And then I'm just gonna take this plate off of the bolt. And then I'm gonna put that bolt right back in. Now with that pin pushed back through, we can thread our nut back on. And now I'll take that 15mm socket. I've still got the vice grips on here to hold it. And we'll tighten that down. And we'll just make sure our U-bolt plate is staying centered. And we can pop off our vice grips and remove our C-clamps. Now next we can install our lift block. You're gonna have the pin side going down and the open side going up. So slide that in and then lift up a little bit on our leaf spring to get that into place. And once I have that in the two holes, I'm gonna start to raise the pole jack up. And then I can take my two new U-bolts slide these into place. And then we can go under and get our bracket and our nuts installed. Next, we can slide our bracket onto our U-bolts. And then we can thread on our new washers and nuts. Now just make sure that your U-bolts are centered at the top. And then we'll grab a 22mm socket. We're gonna go in an X-shaped pattern and tighten this down evenly. So now we have to assemble our new shock. We have our bushings that we need to press in. Now it's recommended to do this with a press. However, if you don't have one, you can do one with a rubber mallet. So now we'll start out with the bushing. We'll get that in place. Get that started, pushing it in. And then you can take your mallet, give it a couple taps until it's in place and through on the other side. And then you can take your sleeve, press that in, and give that a couple taps. And come down to the other side and do that exact same thing. Pop your sleeve in there and give that a couple taps. Now you can do that same thing for your other shock and we'll get these on the truck. So now we can install our shocks. So we'll get our bolt hand threaded into the top mount first. And now we can work on our bottom mount. So now we're ready to get our lower shock into our lower mount. Now to do this, I have a pry bar. We've got a good bit, we gotta compress this to get the holes to line up. So I'm gonna put the pry bar right on the edge here and then use that to pry on our shock. And we'll just go back and forth, walking it in. And once you get those holes to line up, you grab your bolt. And then you can thread your nut on the other side. And then grab your 21mm socket and wrench, tighten that down. And now we can go back up top and take our 21mm socket to fully tighten down that bolt. And then you can repeat this entire process on the other side. So that'll wrap up this review and install of the Superlift 3-inch suspension lift kit with Bilstein shocks for your 2019 and newer Silverado 1500, excluding Trail Boss and ZR2. Thank you for watching, and for all things Silverado, keep it right here at AmericanTrucks.com.